Hey guys, this is Alex, and welcome to another art history ASMR video. Today we will be looking at this little book, little tiny book about Cezanne. So we're kind of sticking with the Impressionists for now. I do have quite a few art history books, or art coffee table books, so trust me, there are more than just Impressionists. I just figured we might start with them and work our way forward, work our way back. So we've talked in passing about Paul Cezanne in some of my other videos. He was friends with Claude Monet and diverges a little bit from most of the Impressionist school. And his work is really, really cool and innovative, so I'm excited to look at this book from the publishing house of Bristol. It's a little more doable than the other books we've been reading. Just a portrait of Cezanne. This book was put together in 2013, so this is a more recent art book. Something that we'll get into, I'm sure, as we continue to read these, is that many of the books I own and have access to are fairly dated, which will become more important when we think about how art history is thought of these days versus 20, 30, 40 years ago. But we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. This book is made in 2013, so hopefully it's a little more modern. Okay, let's read a little bit about Paul Cezanne. Immovable and constant, he doggedly remained true to himself, regardless of the weather and at all seasons of the year. In depicting the mountain, he was able to record the imperceptible changes in light, the relationship between the different surfaces, interpreting their geometry and quietly measuring out every space. Cezanne's imperturbable steadfastness led him to disagree with everyone, not only with writers and artists, but also with his friends and family. We need only study his self-portraits in order to recognize immediately the character of this obstinate, determined, Provençal painter. He put in an appearance in Paris, but never liked the city. He chose a simple, circumscribed environment consisting of familiar places. He preferred the patiently tamped pipe to the ostentatious cigar of the Impressionists. Rather than attending a noisy bal musette, he would play cards in a country tavern, and he liked to spend his time in a simple rural house in the middle of the country, rather than among the entertainment establishments in Montmartre and along the Seine. It is interesting to study Cezanne's representation of the sea on the French Riviera, which he painted as a plain, not very attractive, blue expanse with an incongruous factory chimney dominating the shore. Moreover, Cezanne's subjects are never associated with the events of everyday life, something that mattered deeply to the Impressionists, but rather with the timeless universe. In his unrelenting remoteness from all fashionable trends, Cezanne was without a doubt the greatest and most introspective artist of his generation. He He intuitively recognized the limitations of Impressionism and foresaw the end of a movement that for him was too concerned with merely depicting the ever-changing appearance of the world and so could not develop further. He returned to a deeper understanding of art history, revisiting subjects, artists, and compositions that had never been declared passé. He anticipated the views and practices of the avant-garde artists of the early 20th century, not only with his first apt observations on art, but above all, with his paintings, which were seen as astoundingly modern. With the exception of a few early works, Cezanne was never interested in pleasing the art critics or the public at large by adapting his style to whatever was fashionable. And yet, in spite of all the solitude and struggle, Cezanne's private life was far removed from that of an artist condemned to a life of misery. It was quite unlike the relentlessly tragic life of Vincent van Gogh, for example, who also lived and worked in Provence, but who was soon defeated by financial cares and his own melancholy. Cezanne's life was lived out against a background of comfortable middle-class prosperity. Nevertheless, it was he who, almost single-handedly, created the basis for 20th century art. He was, in fact, extraordinarily intelligent. He was able to recognize the rules governing art and to dismantle them, one after the other, before putting them back together again. This chapter is called Life. He was born in 1839 in Aix-en-Provence. I think from what I've read, it seems like many of the Impressionists were pretty well off in terms of their upbringing. In 1852, Cezanne became a pupil at the Collège Bourbon, where he met Émile Zola. Zola is a figure that we've talked about a few times. He was a contemporary of the Impressionists and a writer. And one of the books he produced, called L'Oeuvre, was sort of a novelization of a fictional Impressionist painter. His name was Lantier. I did do a whole video about that, but it is lost to the black hole of my hard drive, so maybe we'll revisit it someday. Zola encouraged his friend to be more determined. Is painting to you no more than a whim, which you suddenly decided to study one day when you were bored? Is it just a hobby, a subject which makes a good topic of conversation, a pretext so that you need no longer spend your time studying law? Okay, so his father finally agreed and rented a studio in Paris. He visited the Salon exhibition, the most important official art exhibition of the time, which was held every year. Above all, his study of the old masters was of fundamental importance for his artistic development. He spent long afternoons wandering through the collections at the Louvre, where he was deeply moved by the works of Caravaggio, Zurbarán, Rubens, Velázquez, Tintoretto, Titian, and Veronese. I don't know, I'm going to pronounce so many things wrong and I apologize in advance. At the same time, when confronted by the works of these acknowledged masters, he felt so discouraged that in a moment of crisis he was convinced that he was incapable of painting anything at all. Cezanne's emotional state was governed by his sensitivity and restlessness. This is called Portrait of Louis Auguste Cezanne. My feeling about the provenance of this book is that we must have gotten it at a museum shop in the area. We go to this one a fair bit. Or to before the pandemic. Okay, so he briefly left to go back to Provence, but then returned to Paris. Tried and failed to get into the Académie des Beaux-Arts. Returned to the Académie Suisse, where he saw Monet and Pissarro again and made the acquaintance of Sisley, Basile, and Renoir. From time to time, he sat with his friends in the cafe Guerbois, the favorite rendezvous of artists who would later become known as the Impressionists. Or he spent his time copying the works of the old masters in the galleries of the Louvre. In 1863, the famous Salon des Refus took place at the instigation of Emperor Napoleon III. It showed the works of artists who had been turned down by the jury of the official salon of that year. The event marked an important stage in the development of contemporary and indeed modern art. One of the works shown at the Salon des Refusés, the font's a little tiny. The Salon des Refusés that year was the famous Déjeuner célèbre by Edouard Manet. Yeah, that's a very famous piece. I have a book of Manet works that I want to get to next. I'm sure we'll see that piece. It was scandalous. Oh, yeah, it was a painting that provoked a huge scandal when it was exhibited. Not only because of the choice of the subject, two dressed men having an outdoor meal with two women, one nude and one scantily dressed, but also for its innovative painting style. Cezanne attended the salon with his friend Zola and was impressed by the works of Manet. The works of Gustave Courbet and Eugène Delacroix in particular also made a lasting impression on him. During these years, Cezanne lived alternatively in Provence on the family's Jardin de Buffon estate and in the capital, where he frequented the circles of the Impressionists. He repeatedly, but always unsuccessfully, entered his pictures for the Salon. So the Franco-Prussian War is discussed a little bit in these books as a turning point for the Impressionists. And most of these Impressionists fled France. Monet and Pissarro went to England, but Cezanne returned to Aix-en-Provence with Hortense. At the end of the war, he returned to Paris, where his son Paul was born in 1872. Says the period in Auvers-sur-Oise was crucially important for the development of Cezanne's pictorial language. Between 1872 and 1873, he followed Pissarro's example and began painting en plein air, in other words, outdoors. This enabled him to immerse himself in the subject entirely and to study landscapes with fresh eyes. This is when he started to capture the changing effects of light, which is something that we talked a lot about in the Monet videos. So during the late 1870s, Cezanne painted many works that this author says show very clearly the painterly investigations that obsessed him. The plastic presence, the careful composition of the picture, and the links between the object and space, which gives things a feeling of eternity. All this eventually led Cezanne to painterly solutions that were often diametrically opposed to those of Impressionism. At this stage of life, Cezanne was restless, still searching for the right place and the right subjects. When his father passed away in 1886, Cezanne inherited a significant amount of money. This is around the same time that Zola published L'Oeuvre, in which he tells the story of an unsuccessful artist named Claude Lantier, a failed genius incapable of finishing a painting. Cezanne immediately recognized himself in the portrait of the artist. In fact, Zola, who had initially supported the young Impressionist painters, had later distanced himself from them. His novel shows exactly what he thought of them. Cezanne put an end to their 30 years of friendship. The two men would never meet again. In 1887, he returned to the family home in Aix, where he continued to work away. The paintings he produced over the next 10 years reveal an intense concentration on the structural texture of his subjects. He analyzed them meticulously and thereby arrived at compositions characterized by tremendous solidity and harmony. In 1900, Maurice Denis painted his famous group portrait, Homage to Cezanne, to express his admiration of the provincial master. Denis also used his influence to ensure that Cezanne was permitted to exhibit his works at the Salon des Indépendants in 1902. This is L'Estaque. During the last years of his life, Cezanne's preferred subject was Mont Sainte-Victoire. On the 15th of October, while he was completely absorbed in his work, he was caught unawares by a violent storm. He suffered a seizure and lost consciousness. He was finally brought home by a passerby. His health, already weakened by diabetes, deteriorated rapidly. Oh my gosh, it's tragic. The following day, Cezanne decided to get up in order to complete a portrait of his gardener, Vallier, but after a short time he felt unwell again. He died in Aix on the 22nd of October. His wife and son set out in haste from Paris, but arrived too late to see him again alive. The following year, 56 oil paintings and a number of watercolors by Cezanne were exhibited in the Salon d'Automne. It was his first retrospective and a belated act of homage to his extraordinary achievement. There's a self-portrait with a cat. Cezanne's fame as the artist hermit of Aix-en-Provence began to grow rapidly shortly after his death. The exhibitions that took place even during the first few years clearly prove the extent to which his art was valued. In his study, The Art of Cezanne, Kurt Badt wrote that Cezanne's uniqueness lies in the way that, with the appearance of a carefully preserved objectivity, he nonetheless captures both his own personality and the tenor of his era. It's a striking image, huh? I always think it's interesting when artists can manage to make their self-portraits seem as if they're really gazing at you. This part is about Cezanne's reputation and exhibitions following his death. This is Paul Cezanne Jr. I love the solidness of the forms in Cezanne's pieces. It's like unafraid to make dark shapes and lines, things like that. a few paintings that kind of caught my eye, so I thought we could talk about them. I'm trying to be more aware of not taking too long to go through these books. So this piece is called Madame Cezanne in a Red Armchair. This is Cezanne's wife, Hortense. They met in 1869 in Paris, where the 19-year-old worked as a model. Cezanne, who was at the time financially dependent on his father, did not tell him about his relationship with Hortense or about the birth of his son Paul in 1872. So they had a child pretty soon after meeting. She was quite a young mom. He didn't marry Hortense until his father passed away. In the portraits of this period, Cezanne abandoned the intense expressivity of his earlier work. He began to pay more attention to his subjects as he had been taught by Pissarro. The symbolically monumental figure of the young woman is depicted from the front in an interior. The painting as a whole constitutes a palette of shades of green. Madame Cezanne's elegant gown is green, as the wallpaper in the background and the shadows of the flesh tones, as is the wallpaper in the shadow. This somewhat subdued palette of colors complements the intense red of the armchair in which the woman has made herself comfortable and which offsets her contour. The colors in this are wild. The lines of the gown, the skirt. This painting is called Poplars. So the author says that this painting was made during a period where Cezanne was intentionally working on his ability to paint landscapes. The only subject of this painting is a long row of poplars, which extends diagonally into the pictorial space, the treetops being silhouetted against a gray sky. The viewer's gaze touches lightly on the green meadow and the small path that leads through the trees before trailing off the dark mass of leaves executed in small brush strokes in the background. I really like this image. This one is called Bathsheba. The author talks a little bit about the history of classical art and painting nudes. I've kind of wondered to myself what's okay for YouTube as far as like nudes portrayed in classical art, but I guess we'll find out. It says that academic painters produced a vast number of male and female nudes painted in studios for models and later incorporated them more complex compositions. They include all types of characters, from the mythological to the contemporary, and from allegories to sensual representations of nudity. The famous Déjeuner sur l'herbe, we talked about a number of times already, depicts naked people from his own time in a natural environment, constituting both a reference to and an undermining of the classical iconography of Diana bathing with her entourage. In painting bathers who were presumably as contemporary as the figures depicted by Manet, Cezanne ventured to follow this long tradition of depicting nudes in natural landscapes. Bathsheba is part of a transition to this new subject, which became one of the primary and recurring elements in the artist's oeuvre, and would later also inspire Picasso. The biblical heroine Bathsheba was the lover and, following the death of her husband Uriah, wife of King David and the mother of King Solomon. She is here depicted undressed at the edge of a pool of water, accompanied by an obliging maid. The sensuous female figure lying on a blue cloth appears almost to melt into her environment, which mirrors her curves. The two women, their forms hinted at in a sketch-like manner, are completely absorbed by the landscape, a dreamlike and fantastical apparition beyond time and space. Here Cezanne does not pursue his search for the geometric, but rather creates a paradis artificiel steeped in sensuality. Yeah, just look at the curves and the softness of it. Yeah, it's not traditional at all as far as like how nudes were painted in art, traditional art to that point. This is another self-portrait painted in 1882. It talks a little bit about Cezanne applying his learnings from working in plein air, so painting outside, to painting inside, where you have more control over your subject and light, things like that. It says that in this self-portrait, the culminating point is the high, wide forehead of the artist, who appears to be looking at himself attentively in the mirror at close range. Light enters from the left, illuminating the face and drawing attention to the angular eyebrows, the small eyes, the pointed nose, and the dense full beard. The gray of the suit is only slightly relieved by the white of the shirt, and otherwise appears almost to melt into the dark background. Yeah, I think like a really common artist trick is to have contrast between the foreground and the background. And this is probably a dumb observation, but I like that you can see how he and his son are related. Like their eye shape and their eyebrow shape, it just looks similar. Let's see, here's his son. It's Paul Cezanne Jr. Here's Paul Cezanne, the dad. Isn't that cool? My standard for cool is not that high. These are some of Cezanne's Be There series. And the author says, the still life, traditionally a favorite genre of Flemish painting, attracted Cezanne and also Manet among his contemporaries because of the challenges it presented. In landscape painting, the painters have to tackle the coincidences of the natural environment. In still lifes, by contrast, they must select the objects to be depicted and arrange them on a canvas, which gives them complete control over the composition. One of the elements that makes the still life reproduced here so extraordinary is the multiplicity of angles combined in the painting. They allow the viewer to perceive slightly altered, distorted reality. Nothing is left to chance, and the composition of the objects is bold and finely balanced. The kinds of objects shown here are certainly typical of this period. Fruit, which has always been a reliable and faithful standby for painters, pots, bowls, and a sugar jar, and other articles of daily use combine to form a multifaceted whole. Yeah, there are so many angles and perspectives here. But it gives it an energy and a life that a perfectly rendered still life wouldn't have. I know a lot of these are really famous works, and I'm sorry to skip past them. I just don't want to keep you too long. Okay, so this I wanted to show because the Card Players series is considered very important in terms of Cezanne's catalog. A painting entitled The Card Players, 1635 to 1640, by Louis Lenain, is in the collection of the Museum of Aix-en-Provence. It is possible that it served as inspiration for Cezanne. In any case, he was a regular customer at brasseries, and 5 paintings depict their interiors. 2 to 5 people populate the various versions. He made numerous studies in preparation for these paintings, and they reveal a considerable interest in the subject. The 2 card players sit opposite one another, silently concentrating on their cards. One of them holds a white clay pipe between his lips, and the other wears on his head one of the upturned hats typical of rural workers in the region. Their postures and gestures are mere images of one another, whereby Cezanne has shifted the axis of symmetry slightly to the right of center, as is typical of his work. The narrow room is suggested only by a few essential brushstrokes and pushes the figures into the foreground. Cezanne was clearly not interested in psychology here. Instead, he concentrates entirely on shapes created by the figures' bodies, gestures, and movements. So from what I was reading, there are a number of card players' paintings, and I think one of them sold for a great deal of money in recent years and hasn't been seen since. And there goes a ninja. Be safe, sir. I really love this one. I know I didn't sticky it, but I'm a sucker for when artists leave blank parts of their canvas, and I just love that there's this chunk, and this stuff is just this paint is just very deliberately painted on this man's face. Look at that. It's wild. The funny thing about art and about like rendering reality is that imagine that you were going to paint a face. You probably wouldn't reach for tube cadmium. But look how well this works. Okay, so this is a painting of Mont Sainte-Victoire. And these paintings are considered sort of important for a number of reasons, but one of those being for being an inspiration to Cubists. This author says, The landscape appears to oscillate because Cezanne has carefully outlined each object. He tried out each color before adding it, so to speak, and from day to day he imperceptibly balanced out all of these values in confident harmony, linking them with each other in a muted brightness. And again, we have some bare canvas up here. It might just be damage, but wow. Okay, here we have a still life with skull. My nerdy self immediately thought of Monkey Island and Mort Murray, the talking skull. Okay, so the author says, the still life Cezanne produced during this period, so that being 1890s, are characterized by a return to the darker color tones of his early days. Already an old man himself, he here included a skull, which, with its strong chiaroscuro, contrasts with the delicate shades of the tablecloth and the lively freshness of the apples, pears, and lemons. So it's a period of reflection in his golden years. This one's really neat. You can see the abstractions here. Wow. I like how the author references it here, how the brush strokes are kind of going in different directions. Look at these little apples. Look at that orange. Wow. Amazing. Beignets. Okay, so let's just read a little bit of the final chapter called The Artist and the Man. And here we have a close-up of the bathers. You can see kind of you can see some of Cezanne's brush strokes really clearly here. Really, really neat. So this section is titled A Lonely, Misunderstood Genius. Throughout his life, Paul Cezanne, the hermit of Aix-en-Provence, avoided compromises. He lived entirely for his art, and everything else, from his family to his friends, had to take second place. He said he would prefer to die painting, although he is considered one of the fathers of modern painting, and though his search for new artistic forms of expression formed an important basis for the avant-garde, Cezanne himself was painfully aware of the fact that he was misunderstood and despised. His life was one long struggle, a relentless search for the ways to translate his ideas into forms and colors on canvas. In his hometown, he lived a very retiring life and had little contact with others, but he knew that an artist like me is only born once every 200 years. Wow. So he did have some self-awareness in that respect. During the early years of the 20th century, there were a number of artists and friends of Cezanne who were aware of the significance of his new pictorial language. They saw that he had succeeded in providing decisive answers to the basic problem of the modern age, namely the question of the autonomy of art. Is that the basic problem? Okay. The archaeologist Jules Borrelli recorded his impressions of a visit to the artist in an article published in the magazine Vers et prose in 1911. Last July, I traveled to Aix in order to visit the artist Cezanne. I arrived without introduction and inquired of a bookseller in the town where he lived. At about 2 o'clock, I started to walk uphill along a path to his house, which lay surrounded by fields. Bold. Since I found the door locked, dude, I continued along beneath blue skies between two dry stone walls, and then at a bend in the road, I came across the man I was looking for. That is Cezanne. Like a tradesman returning from a villa with his tools, he was wearing a glazier's shirt and a pointed cap, and shouldering a hunting bag from which the green neck of a bottle emerged. He was carrying his capacious box of capacious box of paints, his canvas, and his easel. Monsieur Cezanne, monsieur. And that was how I surprised this man, who was completely lost in thought as he came down the path. I saw him wince and observed the way a nearby treetop cast its shadow across his sunburnt potter's face. A small, bony face with rosy skin, lively eyes, and a white mustache that he had absent-mindedly rubbed with Prussian blue. I went up to him. Monsieur Cezanne, I have been looking for you because I am longing to see your paintings again. Dude. I was touched by the obvious humility that this trivial sentence provoked in this dear man. It immediately sparked a kind of sympathy that I could no longer explain today. Monsieur, he said to me, you are too kind, you know. Show you some of my attempts? You know, even though I am old, I am still only at the beginning, but I am beginning to understand, if I may say so. I think I understand. So, you love painting. I wish I could show you some Monets. I don't own any. They are very expensive these days. In my opinion, Monet is one of the most talented painters of our time. In the Monet book we were reading last time, there's a little story of Monet inviting Cezanne, I think, to Giverny, and Cezanne meets Renoir, I believe, and is just like bowled over to be in Renoir's presence. It was so cute. We went on up to his studio because I had asked him if I could see it. I saw a high-ceilinged room with bare walls and an open glass door overlooking an olive grove. We went out. Cezanne had removed his smock. He carried his rustic bag over an old coat. As he locked the door, he started to laugh again and said, I am the unhappiest of men. Leaving the studio, they set off toward the town. As they arrived, Borelli asked Cezanne, do you love Aix? And Cezanne replied, I was born here, and I shall die here. I left the town after I had finished school in order to go to Paris, and 21 years later I no longer recognized it. The faces of the young girls I had observed before leaving had changed so greatly. Today everything changes in reality, but not for me. I live in the town of my childhood, and it is in the gaze of the people of my age that I see the past. I love more than anything the sight of people who have grown old without violating the customs of old by adopting the laws of time. And here's where you can see some of these pieces, depending on where you are in the world. Brazil, Britain, the Czech Republic, France, quite a few, Germany, Japan, Russia, Sweden, Switzerland, US. Oh, and here's the chronology. It's a nice little book. you once again to look at this little book about Paul Cezanne. If there are any particular artists or art periods that you'd like me to cover, please leave me a comment, and I would be more than happy to do so. On that note, I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you sleep well. I'll talk to you soon. Bye.